There is a particular accusation that arrives usually in midlife, usually from people who mean well, and it lands on you with the soft weight of concern. They notice you decline. They notice you are not where the gathering is. They notice that the invitations, when they come, are met with a warmth that does not translate into attendance, and they begin to construct a story about you, a story in which something has gone quietly wrong. You hear the words they use: withdrawn, isolating, maybe a little depressed. They say it kindly, and the kindness is part of what makes it difficult to answer, because to defend yourself would be to confirm the premise that a defense is required. What none of them can see, and what you yourself may not have fully named, is that the staying home is not a retreat from life, it is a return to it. The distinction matters more than almost anything else here, because the entire culture is organized around the assumption that presence at the gathering is the proof of a life well lived, and absence from it the symptom of a life going wrong. You have begun, without quite deciding to question that assumption from the inside, and the questioning has reorganized where you place yourself in the world. For most of your life you were reliable in your going. When the room filled, you were in it, and you performed the small continuous labor that a room requires. The attentiveness, the responsiveness, the management of your own face so that it registered the appropriate enthusiasm at the appropriate moments. You did this so automatically that you never experienced it as labor. It felt like simply being a person among people. The cost of it was invisible to you because it had always been there, the way the weight of the body is invisible until something lifts it. Then, somewhere in the last several years, the cost became visible, not through insight but through fatigue. You began to notice that you returned from the gathering emptied rather than filled, that the hours among people withdrew something from you that took days to replenish, and that the replenishment happened only in solitude, only in the quiet of a room with no one in it to be managed. The noticing was slow. At first you blamed the particular evening, the particular people, the particular mood you had been in. Only gradually did the pattern assemble itself into a fact you could no longer attribute to circumstance. Jung made a distinction here that the popular vocabulary has flattened into a personality quiz, and the flattening has cost the idea its depth. The terms introvert and extrovert, as he used them, were not descriptions of whether you enjoy parties. They named the fundamental direction in which your psychic energy moves, the orientation of the libido, to use his word, toward the outer world of objects or toward the inner world of the subject. The extrovert is energized by the movement of energy outward toward people, events, the external field. The introvert finds that the same outward movement depletes, and that energy returns only when it flows inward, toward the interior life where the real events for this type take place. If you are built in the inward direction, then the going out that the culture demands was always a withdrawal from your own center. This is the reversal that no one around you can perceive. They believe that to be in the room is to be present, and to be alone is to be absent. For you, the truth runs the other way. The room scattered you. It pulled your energy outward into 100 small attentions until there was nothing left at the center. And you came home to find yourself depleted of the very substance that the solitude would slowly restore. The gathering did not connect you to life. It exiled you from the only place your life actually happens. But this is not yet the real reason, and to stop here would be to mistake temperament for the whole story. The orientation of your energy explains why the gatherings tire you. It does not explain the particular quality of what is happening now, the deepening of the pull homeward, the sense that the staying in is not merely restful but necessary, that something is being done in the solitude that could not be done anywhere else. Temperament is the soil. What is growing in it is something else. Consider what changes when a person reaches the second half of life. Jung observed that the tasks of the first half and the second half are not the same, and that the failure to recognize the difference is the source of an enormous amount of midlife suffering. The first half of life is oriented outward by necessity. You build the social self, the persona, the network of relationships and roles and obligations through which a person establishes their place in the world. This work requires the room, it requires the gatherings, the alliances, the constant negotiation of one's standing among others. For the young person, going out is not a depletion, it is the building of the very structure within which a life will be lived, and then the structure is built and something shifts. The energy that went outward to build the social world begins on its own, without your permission, to turn inward. This is not pathology, it is the psyche reorienting toward the second of its great tasks, which is not the building of the outer life, but the discovery of the inner one. The gatherings that once built something now build nothing, because the building they were for is finished. To keep attending them with the old devotion would be to keep constructing a house that is already complete, adding rooms no one will live in, while the actual work, the work of the second half, goes undone. The pull homeward, then, is the psyche redirecting your energy toward a task that can only be done alone. You feel it as a preference for solitude. What it actually is, beneath the preference, is a summons. Something in you has finished with the outer building and has turned to face the interior. And the turning is so quiet, so lacking in announcement, that you experience it merely as a reluctance to go out. The reluctance is the surface of a far deeper movement. The libido has reversed its direction, and it is carrying your attention toward the only territory that the second half of life requires you to explore. This is why the concern of others, however kindly meant, cannot reach the truth of your situation. They are still inside the first half assumption that energy properly flows outward, that the gathering is where life is, that the person who stays home has lost something or is hiding from something. They interpret your inward turn through the only frame they have. And within that frame, it can only appear as decline. They cannot see that what looks like withdrawal from their position is from yours. The beginning of the most important work a human being is given to do. The disappearance they grieve is not a disappearance at all. It is an arrival they have no category to perceive. By autumn, the invitations had begun to space themselves out, the way water finds its level, and she noticed that the spacing brought relief rather than the loneliness she had been warned to expect. She had braced for the ache of being left out. The ache did not come. What came instead was a slow filling of the hours she had previously surrendered, and the filling had a quality she struggled to name, because it was not activity exactly. It was more like the return of an interior she had not visited in years, rooms in herself that had stood empty while she was out building a life among others. To understand what is happening in those reclaimed hours, you have to look at what the gathering was actually doing to your relationship with yourself. And not only with your energy, the room did not merely deplete you, it also kept you occupied at a level that prevented a particular kind of encounter, the encounter with your own interior, which can only take place in conditions of sustained quiet. As long as you were among people, your attention was pointed outward, managing impressions, reading faces, sustaining the continuous performance of sociability. There was no surface left over on which the inner life could appear. The crowd was not only a drain, it was also, more subtly, a hiding place. Jung wrote that the meeting with oneself is among the most unpleasant things a person can be asked to do, and that we go to remarkable lengths to avoid it. We fill the hours, we seek the company, we keep the radio of external life playing, so that the silence in which the self might speak never fully arrives. The social life, for many people, functions precisely as this avoidance. It is not always loneliness that drives us into rooms full of people. Sometimes it is the opposite, a flight from the solitude in which we would have to meet the parts of ourselves we have spent a lifetime not looking at. The extrovert by temperament may genuinely be nourished by company, but a great many people who are not extroverts at all keep going out for a reason they would never admit, which is that going out spares them the encounter with what waits in the quiet. So when the pull homeward arrives, it is not only your energy reversing direction, it is also your readiness, at last, to stop avoiding the meeting. This is why it comes in the second half of life rather than the first. The young psyche is not yet ready for that encounter, and the busyness of building the outer world serves a real purpose in postponing it until the structure is strong enough to survive the inward turn. But the postponement cannot be permanent. At some point, the psyche judges that you are ready, or that the time remaining no longer permits further delay, and it begins to withdraw its investment from the outer field and turn you, gently at first and then insistently, toward the interior you have been outrunning your whole life. A man once described a dream that returned to him over the course of a difficult year. In the dream, he came home to his own house to find a wing of it he had never entered. A series of rooms behind a door he had always assumed led to a closet. The rooms were furnished, lived in, dusty with long disuse, and he understood in the dream that they had been there the entire time, that the house he had lived in for decades was far larger than the portion he had occupied, and that he had spent his life in a few small rooms, while the greater part of the dwelling stood waiting behind a door he had never thought to open. He woke, he said, with the specific disquiet of a man who realizes he has been a guest in his own home. The dream is among the most common that the psyche produces at this stage, and its meaning is not obscure. The house is the self. The occupied rooms are the portion of the personality you developed in order to function in the outer world. The persona and its supporting structures to the self you built to be among others. The unentered wing is everything you set aside in the building. The interests you did not pursue, the parts of your nature that did not fit the social role, the whole interior country you sealed behind a door because the first half of life had no time for it. The dream announces that the door can now be opened. The pull homeward is, at the deepest level, the pull toward that wing of the house, the rooms that have stood furnished and waiting while you lived in the small front portion the world could see. You cannot open that door at a gathering. This is the simple structural fact beneath your reluctance to go out. The work of the second half requires the conditions that only solitude provides, the sustained quiet in which the inner figures can finally make themselves known. The dream came to the man in solitude. In sleep, in the one territory the daytime crowd could not reach, the unconscious speaks in the silence, and if you fill every silence with company, it has no medium in which to address you. The staying home is the clearing of a channel you are making, perhaps without knowing it, the conditions under which the rest of the house can finally be entered. There is friction here, and the friction is real because the part of you that built the outer life does not easily cede authority to the part that is now turning inward. The persona, in the social self you constructed with such care, experiences the inward turn as a threat to its dominion. It has run your life for decades. It knows how to be among people, how to perform, how to secure your standing in the external world, and it interprets the pull homeward as a kind of failure, a falling off, a loss of the very capacities it spent so long developing. The voice in you that says you should go out, that worries you are isolating, that frets about what people will think, is often the voice of the persona defending its territory against an encroachment it cannot understand. This is why the inward turn so often arrives accompanied by guilt, and why the guilt feels disproportionate to the offense of simply staying home. You are not merely declining an invitation, you are, at a level beneath your awareness, withdrawing energy from the structure that has governed your life, and that structure protests its dethronement in the only language it has, which is the language of obligation and social anxiety. The guilt is the sound of the old governing system losing its grip. It feels like conscience. It is closer to a deposed authority insisting it still rules. Jung understood that the second half of life requires a kind of dying, the relinquishing of the persona's absolute authority, so that the larger self can come forward. This is not the death of the social self, which remains useful and necessary in its place. It is the end of its tyranny, the end of the arrangement in which the self you built to be seen by others is permitted to crowd out the self that exists when no one is watching. The inward turn is the beginning of that transfer of authority. The energy that the persona once commanded is being redirected toward a center deeper than the persona, and the redirection feels to the persona like loss, and feels to the deeper self like a long delayed coming home. What you are protecting when you protect your solitude against the concern of others is not your comfort and not your introversion. Though it may wear those names, you are protecting the conditions under which the second half of your life can actually take place. The door to the unentered wing has appeared, and it can only be opened in the quiet, and some part of you knows this with a certainty that no amount of social pressure can dislodge. You stay home because the work has changed. The building is finished. What remains is to inhabit the whole of the house you spent so long constructing from the outside. 3 weeks later, the guilt had not disappeared, but it had changed its address. Where it had once spoken in the voice of others, the friend who worried, the relative who hinted, it now spoke from inside her, in her own voice. At the threshold of every evening, she chose to keep for herself. This was the more difficult form. External pressure can be resisted, even resented, but a voice that wears your own face and speaks in the accent of your own conscience is harder to recognize as an adversary. She would settle into the quiet she had been craving all day, and within an hour the voice would begin, "You are wasting your life. You are becoming strange. Something is wrong with a person who prefers this." This is the shadow material of the inward turn, and it is essential to face it, because the story of the misunderstood introvert reclaiming her solitude is only half the structure, and the flattering half. The harder truth is that not all of the staying home is the psyche's summons toward the second half of life. Some of it is avoidance, and the avoidance is real. And the inability to tell the two apart is precisely what keeps so many people stranded at this threshold for years. The pull homeward can be the libido reversing toward its proper inward work. It can also be fear wearing the mask of that work, fear of the gathering, fear of judgment, fear of the encounter with others that has, over the years, accumulated a charge it did not used to carry. The two feel nearly identical from inside. Both produce the reluctance to go out, only their roots differ. And the roots are buried. Jung was unsparing on this point, and his unsparingness is a gift, because The sentimental version of the inward turn does you no service. He warned against the danger of mistaking regression for individuation, of dressing up a retreat from life in the noble language of inner work. The psyche that turns inward to do the genuine work of the second half is one thing. The psyche that turns inward because it has been wounded by the outer world and wishes never to risk that wound again is something else. And the something else does not deserve the dignity we are tempted to grant it. There is a withdrawal that is the beginning of depth, and there is a withdrawal that is the beginning of a slow constriction, a narrowing of the life until it fits inside a room from which nothing can hurt you and inside which nothing can grow. The shadow you must meet, then, is the possibility that your solitude is not entirely sovereign, that woven into the legitimate inward turn is a thread of simple avoidance, an unwillingness to be seen, a fear of the exposure that any genuine encounter with another person requires. This is uncomfortable to consider precisely because the legitimate version is so close at hand, so available as an explanation, so flattering. It is easy to tell yourself the story of the deep soul reclaiming her interior life. It is harder to ask whether some portion of the staying home is the deep soul and some portion is merely fear, and harder still to sit with the fact that you may not be able to fully separate them. There is a will to power hidden in the inward turn, and it disguises itself well. The person who withdraws can occupy a position of subtle superiority over those who still go out, who still need the crowd, who have not yet, as the story goes, awakened to the deeper life. You can begin to look down gently on the people at the gatherings, on their chatter, their dependence on company, their inability to be alone. The contempt is quiet and it feels like discernment, but it is contempt, and it serves the same function that all contempt serves, which is to convert a fear into a virtue. If the people at the gathering are shallow, then your absence from it is depth rather than avoidance. The judgment of them protects you from the harder judgment of yourself. A woman returned across several sessions to a dream she could not shake. In the dream, she lived in a small, perfect room, beautifully ordered, every object in its place, and the room had no door, only a window through which she watched the street below. People passed and called up to her, and she answered them pleasantly through the glass, and the arrangement seemed, in the dream, entirely satisfactory. Then she noticed, with the slow horror that belongs to dreams, that there was no door because she had walled it up herself, brick by brick, and that the perfection of the room was the perfection of a thing that had stopped being entered or left. She woke, she said, unable to decide whether the room was a sanctuary or a cell, and the inability to decide was the whole disturbance of the dream. The dream was naming the exact ambiguity you stand inside. The walled room is the solitude, and the dream refuses to tell her whether it is sanctuary or cell, because that is precisely the question she has not answered and cannot answer from where she stands. The window through which she pleasantly addresses the passers-by is the persona's last concession, the maintained appearance of connection that costs nothing and risks nothing. And the door she walled up herself is the recognition that the enclosure was not done to her. She built it. The fear that drove the building wore the face of preference, and the room it made was genuinely beautiful. And the beauty is part of the trap, because a cell that is also a sanctuary is the hardest cell to leave. Here is the distinction that separates the genuine inward turn from its counterfeit. And it is the only reliable one. The genuine turn inward eventually turns back outward. The work of the second half is not a permanent retreat. It is a descent into the interior for the purpose of returning, changed, to a life among others that can now be lived from the center rather than the surface. The descent has a rhythm, an inhalation and an exhalation, a going in that prepares a coming out. The counterfeit has no exhalation. It goes in and stays in. It calls the staying depth, and it walls the door a little higher each year, and it watches the street through glass and tells itself the glass is a kind of intimacy. So the question you must ask of your solitude is not whether it is restful, because the cell rests you as surely as the sanctuary does. The question is whether anything is moving. Is the inward turn producing change, encounter, the slow opening of the unentered rooms? Or is it producing only the deepening comfort of a life from which risk has been progressively removed? Jung held that the unconscious meets us halfway only when we genuinely engage it, and that a withdrawal which engages nothing, which merely avoids, receives nothing in return. The empty room can be the antechamber to the whole house, or it can be the whole house shrunk to a single chamber. The furniture looks the same, only the direction of the movement reveals which one you are in. This is the harder layer, and it does not resolve into reassurance, and it should not. You are not, by staying home, automatically engaged in the noble work of the second half. You may also be hiding, and the hiding may be braided so tightly into the genuine inward pull that you cannot pull the two threads apart by act of will. What you can do is watch for the exhalation. You can ask whether your solitude has a door, or whether you have been quietly bricking it up while telling yourself the room was always meant to be sealed. The voice that calls you strange in the evening quiet may be the deposed persona defending its old territory, or it may sometimes be the deeper self noticing that the door is gone and asking without accusation who it was that walled it shut. By winter the question had stopped tormenting her and had become, instead, a kind of companion. She no longer demanded of every quiet evening that it justify itself, no longer interrogated each declined invitation for evidence of avoidance or evidence of depth. She had stopped trying to resolve the ambiguity by force, and in the stopping something had loosened. She understood by then that the distinction between sanctuary and cell was not a verdict to be reached once and filed away. It was a discernment to be practiced evening after evening, a question kept alive rather than answered. And the keeping alive was itself the work. What settles into place at this stage is not certainty about whether your solitude is noble or evasive, because that certainty is not available, and the demand for it was always a misunderstanding. What settles is a different relationship to the question itself. The person stranded at the threshold treats the ambiguity as a problem to be solved, and the insolubility torments them, and the torment drives them either back into the gatherings out of guilt or deeper into the walled room out of defiance. The person who has crossed the threshold holds the ambiguity differently. They have learned that solitude is neither sanctuary nor cell in its essence, that it becomes one or the other depending on what is done inside it, and that the doing is theirs to determine and to keep determining as long as they live. Jung held that the goal of the inner work was not the elimination of the shadow, but the conscious relationship with it. The ongoing dialogue between the self and the parts of itself it would prefer not to see. Applied here, this means you will not arrive at a solitude purified of avoidance, a retreat that is all depth and no fear. The fear remains, the thread of evasion remains woven through the legitimate inward turn, and the work is not to extract it, which cannot be done, but to know it is there, to hold it in consciousness, so that it can no longer govern you in secret. The avoidance that you see is no longer the avoidance that walls the door. It is only when the fear operates unseen that it builds the cell, seen, named, kept in the field of awareness. It loses the power to constrict a life without your knowledge. This is the difference between the walled room of the dream and the room you now inhabit. The woman in the dream had walled the door without knowing it, brick by brick, in a kind of sleep, and the horror of the dream was the discovery that the enclosure had been self-made and unconscious. The room you live in now has a door because you have kept the door conscious. You know that your solitude could become a cell. You watch for the signs. You ask in the evening, quiet, whether anything is moving, whether the inward turn is still turning or has settled into mere avoidance, and the asking itself is the door. A solitude that questions itself cannot fully wall itself in. The vigilance is the opening through which the air still moves. A dream came at the turning of the year, and it did not return, which is itself significant, because the dreams that repeat are the ones whose question has not been received. And the dreams that come once and depart are often the ones that arrive after the question has been taken in. In the dream she was in the house with the unentered wing, the rooms she had glimpsed in the earlier dream, but now she was moving through them, opening windows, letting the light into spaces that had stood dark. She was not living in them yet. She was airing them, preparing them, and she understood in the dream that this was slow work, that the rooms could not be inhabited all at once, that a house unlived in for decades is entered gradually or not at all, she woke without disquiet, with only the quiet sense of a task that had properly begun. The dream completed the arc that the earlier dreams had opened. The first dream announced the unentered wing and the disquiet of having lived as a guest in one's own house. The second, the walled room, raised the shadow question. Whether the inward turn was sanctuary or cell, this third dream did not resolve that question into a verdict. It did something more useful. It showed her inside the rooms, working, airing them out, neither triumphantly arrived nor permanently sealed, but engaged in the slow, ongoing labor of inhabiting what had stood empty. The light entering the dark rooms is the consciousness entering the interior that the first half of life had no time for, and the slowness, the acknowledgement that the house is entered gradually, is the dream's correction of the fantasy that the second half of life delivers its rewards on any timeline. The ego would prefer you enter the unentered rooms slowly or not at all. This is the structural fact. The work rests on the interior that the inward turn opens toward, cannot be taken at once, cannot be conquered or completed, can only be inhabited, room by room, across whatever years remain. The staying home is the time in which this inhabiting takes place, and that is its legitimate function, distinct at last from the avoidance that merely seals. The difference, finally legible, is this: avoidance enters nothing. It walls the door and calls the enclosure peace. The genuine inward turn enters, slowly, opening room after room. And the opening is endless, because a self is not a house with a fixed number of chambers, but a dwelling that reveals new wings. The longer one is willing to explore it. There is a loss to grant here, and it should be granted plainly, because the version of this that promises only enrichment is dishonest. Something does end when you stop measuring your life by your presence at the gathering. A certain kind of belonging ends, the belonging of the person who is reliably there, who is counted on, who occupies a known place in the social field. The people who valued that version of you do lose something real, and you lose the particular warmth of being that person among them. The inward turn is not free. It costs the standing you built in the first half of life, the standing that came from being present, available, woven into the collective. You are allowed to feel that loss. Feeling it does not mean you have chosen wrongly. It means the choice was a real choice, with a real price, as the genuine ones always are. What you receive in exchange is not a fuller social life, and the frameworks that promise the reclaimed introvert a richer connection often quietly mislead. What you receive is the house. You receive the slow entry into rooms that stood furnished and waiting your whole life. In the encounter, you spent the first half of life outrunning the meeting with the self that can only happen in the quiet you have learned to protect. You receive the discernment that keeps the door open, the vigilance that prevents the sanctuary from hardening into a cell, and you receive, on the better evenings, the specific peace of a person who is no longer hiding in company, and no longer hiding in solitude, but simply at home in the whole of the dwelling, with the light moving room to room, the concern of others will continue, because they remain inside the first half frame and cannot see the work the quiet is doing. Let them. Their story about your withdrawal was never going to match the truth of your arrival. What was named as isolation was the clearing of a channel. What was lived as avoidance has been brought into the light and stripped of its power to wall you in. The gathering has been declined. The house has been entered.
This has been Carl Jung Original, a space where the patterns most people live through can finally be named. Voice and imagery, AI-assisted interpretation and framing, original work. Until next lecture.